Hello students, today we are going to discuss a story which is a part of your supplementary reader textbook Footprints Without Feet. The very first chapter is A Triumph of Surgery, written by James Herriot. James Herriot was a British veterinary surgeon and writer who used his many years of experience as a veterinary surgeon to write a series of books consisting of stories about animals and their owners. First of all, let us discuss the title of the story, that is A Triumph of Surgery. Dear students, triumph means victory, and surgery here is not the medical surgery but the veterinary hospital. So it means the victory of one particular veterinary hospital. Now look at the major characters of the story. There are three major characters. First one is Tricky, a small and pampered dog. Another is Mr. Herriot, who is the narrator and veterinary surgeon as well. Third one is Mrs. Pumphrey, a rich mistress who had a small pet dog named Tricky. Let's see what is there in the story. James Herriot, a veterinarian doctor, narrates the story of Tricky, the dog, and how he gets better. He saw Tricky one day with his owner, Mrs. Pumphrey. James was shocked to see Tricky's appearance. He was seriously overweight and had bloodshot eyes. Bloodshot means red eyes. Apart from this, his eyes were rheumy. Rheumy means watery. When James asked about him, she told that she felt that Tricky was no longer energetic and lacked excitement. She thought that Tricky was suffering from malnutrition, so she fed him some malt, cod liver oil, and a bowl of Horlicks. She also confessed that she fed him some cream cakes and chocolates. James realized the situation was bad. He knew Tricky could never say no to food. The narrator also knew that Mrs. Pumphrey may not have told him the entire truth. So, he gave the lady some stern advice that if she did not observe precautions and did not control Tricky's diet, and if he was not given any exercise, he would soon fall seriously ill. However, as he watched Mrs. Pumphrey walk away with Tricky, he thought it wouldn't be long before he heard from her. Sure enough, Mrs. Pumphrey called a few days later. Mrs. Pumphrey was very upset. She told the doctor that Tricky was not eating anything, not even his favorite dishes, and was vomiting frequently. Also, he was too weak to do anything. James had already made a plan by then. He knew that the only way to cure Tricky was to get him away from the house and keep him in his clinic. So, he came to Mrs. Pumphrey's house and suggested that Tricky needed hospitalization for 15 days. Mrs. Pumphrey was almost fainted at the suggestion, but the narrator was firm. He assured Mrs. Pumphrey that this was the only option he had. Grabbing hold of Tricky, James carried him down to his car. The whole household was in an uproar. The staff rushed about getting blankets, bowls, clothes, and toys for Tricky. The narrator, realizing the items would not fit in his car, quickly drove away. From his rear view mirror, he saw the entire household standing on the road in tears. When they reached at the clinic, all the other dogs gathered around the doctor. Tricky, in contrast, just stared at them with dull eyes. For the next 2 days, Tricky was given only water and no food. At the end of second day, Tricky started showing some interest in his surroundings. On the third day, the narrator led Tricky to the other dogs playing in the yard. Tricky slowly followed the dogs around as they played. Later, after the dogs were fed, Tricky sniffed their bowls and licked them casually. The next day, an extra bowl was kept for him. Harriet was happy to see Tricky running towards his bowl, and he joined the other dogs for his meal. That was a turning point for Tricky. He was accepted by the other dogs as their family member. From then, he made rapid progress. He ran around with the other dogs, fighting them for food and hunting rats at night. He seemed to be enjoyed all the activities which he had never done before. Meanwhile, Mrs. Pumphrey continued to be concerned about Tricky. She would call up more than 12 times a day to inquire about Tricky. Mr. Harriet initially avoided questions about coats and bed, etc., but he simply told her that Tricky was recovering fast. On hearing that, Mrs. Pumphrey started bringing around baskets of eggs. Later, Mrs. Pumphrey started sending bottles of wine to improve Tricky's blood. Lunch became a fun affair with glasses of wine before and during the meal for the narrator and his partner. Finally, she sent a bottle of brandy. Mr. Harriet was unable to believe that Mrs. Pumphrey actually wanted to give brandy to Tricky. But he knew that it was not good for dog, so like eggs and the wine, the narrator and the partner shared it amongst themselves. Mr. Harriet was happy to note that he could start his day with extra eggs, followed by wine in the afternoon, and finally brandy in the evening. He was so happy that he was almost tempted to keep Tricky as a permanent guest at the surgery. But he knew that Mrs. Pumphrey was suffering and must be waiting eagerly for Tricky. After 15 days, he called her and gave her the news that she could come and pick him up. Within few minutes, Mrs. Pumphrey arrived at the clinic. There was a marked change in Tricky now. No longer was he a fat and bloated animal. Now he was agile. Agile means able to move quickly and well muscled and kept up well with James' dogs. James carried Tricky back to Mrs. Pumphrey's car. The minute Tricky saw his owner, he jumped out of Tricky's arm and rushed at Mrs. Pumphrey. She tried to defend herself as Tricky barked and licked her face. Mrs. Pumphrey, with tearful eyes, thanked James, and she believed it was really a triumph of surgery. Dear students, I hope you enjoyed this story. Now let us discuss the theme of this story. The story emphasizes that overindulgence and pampering beyond a limit becomes unproductive. Be it a pet or a child, taking care in a proper way is necessary. Undoubtedly, the parents or the masters always have good intentions, but excess of everything is bad. Thank you.